Today I want to complete my introduction to the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun by focusing on what he identifies as the actual process of civilization. And I especially want to focus on the nature of human labor, both its social and its individual aspects, and especially there on the relationship between cooperation and coercion. So, the subject of Ibn Khaldun's book is civilization. Right? As he says back on page 8, in this work, I commented on civilization, on urbanization, and on the essential characteristics of human social organization. Right? But what exactly do we mean by civilization? Well, we mean that environment itself constructed by human beings that allows for the development and indeed the flourishing of our distinctively human capacities. So civilization in that sense is a goal for us, right? It's what we as human beings naturally strive for, right? And again, you remember he made more or less that point in chapter 2 when he was talking about the Bedouin people versus the sedentary people. And he said, this is on page 93 in section 3 from chapter 2, he says, the toughness of desert life precedes the softness of sedentary life. Therefore, urbanization is found to be the goal to which the Bedouin aspires. Sedentary people, on the other hand, have no desire for desert conditions. Right? So basically he's saying, we have a natural drive towards that kind of civilized life. And because it makes our life better. When we're in that situation, we don't want to go back. So in the city, remember also, that's the domain of crafts. And so that's where we get to develop an ever richer world where we can just sort of do more and more stuff and deal more and more effectively with our needs and desires. But now, how does civilization come about? Well, it has to be made by people, right? And what it distinctively requires is what we would call the division of labor. Right? So as he says on page 263 at the beginning of chapter 4, towns and cities with their monuments, vast constructions, and large buildings are set up for the masses, not for the few. Therefore, united effort and much cooperation are needed for them. Again, he says that's the same thing a few pages later, the beginning of section 3, on page 265. The construction of cities can be achieved only by united effort, great numbers, and the cooperation of workers. Right? So the fact that human civilization has come into being depends on human cooperative practice. And he spells that out in quite a bit more detail in section 11. Now page 273, so I'm going to read a chunk of that. He says, the individual human being cannot by himself obtain all the necessities of life. All human beings must cooperate to that end in their civilization. But what is obtained through the cooperation of a group of human beings satisfies the need of a number many times greater than themselves. For instance, no one by himself can obtain the share of the wheat he needs for food. But when 6 or 10 persons, including a smith and a carpenter to make the tools, and others who are in charge of the oxen, the plowing of the soil, the harvesting of the ripe grain, and all the other agricultural activities, undertake to obtain their food and work toward that purpose either separately or collectively, and thus obtain through their labor a certain amount of food, that amount will be food for a number of people many times their own. The combined labor produces more than the needs and necessities of the workers, right? So, by yourself, if you're just on your own, you can't really make your life work. You'd be scrambling just to exist, and good chance you'd fail. But when people work together, not only can they solve that problem, but through working together, they can produce massively more material, food or whatever, than they themselves need. And so then he goes on, he says in the next paragraph, if the labor of the inhabitants of the town or city is distributed in accordance with the necessities and needs of those inhabitants, a minimum of that labor would suffice. But the labor available is more than is needed. Consequently, it is spent to provide the conditions and customs of luxury and to satisfy the needs of the inhabitants of other cities. They import the things they need from people who have a surplus through exchange or purchase, etc., etc. So the point is, when we work together, A, we can carry out the basic requirement that we satisfy our collective needs. But B, we can go farther and make our life better. We can make a more comfortable, more luxurious, fuller, richer world through our cooperative labor. And that is the way civilization develops. Right? Indeed, as Aristotle, who talks about the same theme, said at the beginning of Book 1 of the Politics, people initially get together simply to deal with the needs of living. But as they make these bigger communities, they are making a world that makes for the good life, makes for living well, rather than just minimally existing. And I just want to add one more point about that, right? That development of an ever more sophisticated world then also brings about the need for ever greater sophistication in the tasks we can carry out, and therefore the crafts, the skills that we develop, right? And so he says that back in chapter 3. He talks about civilization as producing a life of ease and increased opportunities. He says sedentary culture is a diversification of luxury that concerns, for instance, food, clothing, building, carpets, utensils, and other household needs. Each one of these things requires special interdependent crafts serving to refine and improve it. So the point I want to bring out there was just this thought that the development of our sophisticated culture requires the development of sophisticated crafts, and especially these things are interdependent, right? And so civilization as a whole, from its minimal conditions to its rich flowering, is throughout premised on interdependence and therefore cooperation, on people working together to bring about a kind of collective goal rather than just working isolatedly on their own individual thing. And as he said, if you ever really just tried to do things on your own, you wouldn't get very far. So we need to cooperate, right? That's characteristic of our humanity. But what's our actual situation like? Well, in chapter 5, in section 6 of that, he says, again, the existence and persistence of the human species can materialize only through the cooperation of all men in behalf of what is good for them. That's what we already said. It has been established that a single human being could not fully exist by himself. And even if, hypothetically, it might happen as a rare exception, his existence would be precarious. Now, so we need that cooperation. Now, he says, such cooperation is obtained by the use of force, since people are largely ignorant of the interests of the human species, and since they are given freedom of choice, and their actions are the result of thinking and reflection, not of natural instinct. They thus refrain from cooperating. So the point there, then, is that we need it to be the case that we cooperate to make a world in which we can all flourish. But even though that's what we need, that's not automatically what we're naturally going to do. And he gives the reason for that. He says those two related things. First, we are ignorant of our own needs. And second, why does that matter? Well, because we're free beings whose actions are based on our perspectives. And so we act out of ignorant perspectives. What does that ignorance amount to? Well, what it really means is that though our needs are collective, we tend to act out of a kind of individual self-interested perspective. Right? So he's said a version of that back in chapter 2. This was in section 7, page 97. He's talking about evil, and he says, the great mass of mankind is in that condition. Evil qualities in man are injustice and mutual aggression. And the injustice he talks about actually pretty directly on pages 306, which is in chapter 5, section 6, and back on 240, which was in chapter 3, section 41. There's a lot to say about it, but to a large extent, injustice means acting for your own immediate gain against the needs of others, right? Which is basically that same point, right? That failure to cooperate where we really should be cooperating. And so people on their own will be inclined to be aggressive, greedy, whatever else, just in general, to be ignorantly limited in their perspective, such that they don't appreciate their own intrinsic dependence upon others and the needs of others. Right? And so if people are going to cooperate, then that tendency they would already have to act in that way needs to be stopped. And they need to be made to act in such a way that they will cooperate with others. Right? And so that's what he said. Back on 305, he said, now such cooperation is obtained by the use of force. Right? And what's that force he's talking about? Well, this is how he begins chapter 4. He says, united effort and much cooperation are needed for the building of towns and cities and so on. He says they are not among the things that are necessary matters of general concern to human beings. As a matter of fact, they must be forced and driven to build cities. The stick of royal authority is what compels them. Thus, dynasties and royal authority are absolutely necessary for the building of cities and the planning of towns. Right? So the real point that Ibn Khaldun wants to make here is that, human civilization really is about human cooperation. It's about human beings working together to make a world that's good for human beings, a world where human beings will be good. But that collective reality, that collective need, itself depends for its realization on powerful leadership, depends on people who have the authority to compel cooperative action, which ultimately means to get people to work in their own best interests. Right? And indeed, that's more or less how he defines royal authority. He says, when he's talking about royal authority and what makes it, real, true royal authority, not just, some nasty person seizing power. He says, the concomitants of good rulership are kindness to and protection of one's subjects. The true meaning of royal authority is realized when the ruler defends his subjects. Right? So the real meaning of rule is about the good of the ruled. And so then he cashes out a little bit more what form that takes, and it relates directly to this point about division of labor. So he says, back in chapter 2 now, on page 113, assigning everybody to his proper station is done out of fairness, and fairness means justice. Right? So the thing he's talking about there is then this idea that governing well means putting people in their right place to do their right work. So, the basic point is then that civilization is a reality that we need and that we depend upon. But generally speaking, it's a reality that exceeds the meaningful grasp of those very people, us, who depend upon it. And so it doesn't really come into being by our collectively sitting down and thinking, oh, we want to make this happen. It's not like that. It will come about through our collective effort. It will only come about through our collective effort. And that collective effort, intelligently and appropriately organized and directed towards the right ends. But that organization and direction will come from a leader, and a leader who has the capacity basically to coerce people, to make it be the case that people will do those things that they need to do, but that they would not choose to do simply on their own. So we've been talking about the work that human beings have to do collectively to make civilization. And I just want to make one small point about that, about labor. This point is essential to economics, which I'm not going to explore here, but I want to just lay the foundation for that. So he said already back in chapter 2, labor is the real basis of profit. And then he developed that more in chapter 3. He said on page 241, labor belongs to the things that constitute capital. Gain and sustenance represent the value realized from labor among civilized people. So, labor is the thing that makes our valuable world. And then so that's how chapter 5 begins. Section 1, he says, profit is the value realized from human labor, which he then goes on to discuss. So, as I said, I'm not going to get into that particularly, but I want you just to think about that idea that when you look around you, everything that you see that is not naturally occurring is something that people made. So it came into being in a very particular way. It came into being by human beings taking things that do naturally occur and working on them. Right? And the product is whatever thing you make, right? The product is the natural world transformed by labor. Of course, that can take a, what would you say, mediated form, because I can, work on the world to make a tool, and then I use that tool to work on the world, maybe to make a more sophisticated tool, and then I use that more sophisticated tool to work on the world. But that just means the significance of that labor that was initially invested in the natural world to make the first tool is just sort of being magnified through these successive stages. So the thing is, whatever you see that is a human-made thing, an artificial thing, in whatever way it is not naturally occurring, that is just a form in which human labor is appearing. It's like the congealed state of a lot of invested labor. Now, that has to do with economics, because what that means is that much labor is kind of what the thing's worth. And so you exploit people if you don't respect their labor and don't compensate them appropriately to the amount of labor they put in, and so on, right? So that gives you a sense of how you might determine the value of things and how you might determine when things are working fairly and not, right? And that's a great study in its own right. I don't want to get into that study, but I want you just to start noticing that point, and especially trying to use that to refine your perception. Right? As you look around at civilization, as you look around at the cultural world that surrounds you, can you start seeing that as labor, as congealed labor, as a kind of memorial to, or the monument of that massive project of human activity? Can you see that as the kind of memorial of work that has been put into something? Can you see those things as sort of recordings of the productive labor of human individuals? So I just want to conclude with one final point. I was just saying, look around and see if you can see the things around you as sort of concretizations of labor. And I say to do that because typically we don't see them that way. We just see the thing. You see a smartphone. You don't see an incredible history of labor embodied in that thing. You see a house, you see a car, you see a donut or a donut shop. Like you relate to that thing in terms of its immediate identity, as if it were a naturally occurring thing. It's just like, oh, it's that thing. But with anything artificial, uh, there is no such thing, right? It's something that people have made. And so what you're seeing is the result of this incredible history of accomplishment. Well, I want to make that same point uh, about civilization in general, um, and about our relationship to it. It's not just donuts and smartphones that we accept as if they're just naturally occurring realities, just there. But we accept our studies that way: chemistry, engineering, philosophy, anything you like. We go to school and we study it as if it's just, I don't know, a set of facts handed down to us there for us to learn. Again, without remembering that what we're studying is the sort of congealed and crystallized product of, in many cases, thousands of years of people struggling to figure stuff out, right? And what we study is we sort of harvest the high points from all that labor and kind of forget about it, right? So, and I guess I could say the same thing about our laws. I could say the same thing about our social customs, right? Everything in our civilization, by virtue of the fact that it is part of civilization, is human labor congealed. Um, but we typically accept it without seeing it as that history of labor. Right? He said a similar thing, remember, about the second generation of people who grow up under some kind of royal authority. This was in chapter 3, section 2. Remember, he said, once royal authority has been passed on by inheritance over many generations and through successive dynasties, the beginnings are forgotten. And the members of that family are clearly marked as leaders. It has become a firmly established article of faith that one must be subservient and submissive to them. Indeed, people will fight with them in their behalf as they would fight for the articles of faith. Right? It's as if obedience to the government were a divinely revealed book that cannot be changed or opposed. Well, my point is that everything in our civilization is like that. Right? We grow up, unlike those people, those Bedouin warriors who went out and made a new thing. We grow up inheriting a world. And by virtue of its being inherited rather than something we earned, rather than something we made, by virtue of its being inherited, we take it for granted. It's just familiar, and it's just like, oh yeah, it's virtually natural. And therefore we don't see its made character and therefore its ambivalent character, right? That it's the way particular people came to do particular things, and maybe they could be otherwise. But we don't see that. We just take it over. So, Ibn Khaldun at the beginning of this book says that what it's really about. This is back on page 5. He says what it's really about is understanding the inner meaning of history. He says he wants to get a deep knowledge of the how and why of events. That's what he's after. And he said history is firmly rooted in philosophy and it deserves to be a counted branch of it. Right? Like he's saying history should be something we study, and it's something we can study. You can understand how things have happened, how the world we have has come into being. But we typically don't do that. We typically aren't historians. And I don't just mean that by profession. I mean, we don't really have an historical consciousness. We relate to history as if it were nature. But you can study it as he is trying to do. And what is it that he's revealing? Well, aside from the many amazingly rich and insightful details that he brings out about the history of particular regimes, especially the Muslim empires of the golden age of Islam and so on, apart from those details, he really brings out a conception that I've been trying to articulate here of what civilization is. And what he's showing you is that it is something we make, but you remember, the people making it, they're making it through their cooperation, but they're being coerced into it because on our own, we don't really grasp our own interests in what we're doing. So it's being made by people who don't really grasp what they're doing. And indeed, even the leaders who are compelling them to do things uh, presumably don't have a brilliant insight into the perfect vision of humanity. In many cases, they're just trying to get power, or trying to take things over, or whatever. But they effectively lead people in productive directions that produce healthy, flourishing civilizations. Uh, it's coming about through human choice and human action, human labor, but it's not something that was particularly understood by the makers. And furthermore, those who go on to live in the thing made by those others live in it largely without insight. In many respects, but especially in this respect, that they take what is historical and treat it as if it's natural. They treat the familiar as if it were, a divinely revealed book, as if it required them to bow down and worship it. That's how we live. And the so one of the things that seems to me that he's then showing about sort of the meaning of history is that the very process of civilization, that the very thing that gives us a flourishing, or gives us an environment in which we can flourish, uh, also conceals its own character in a way that simultaneously uh, propels us into the opposite of flourishing, into ignorant, self-destructive ways of living and thinking, such that we don't understand our own civilization. We become weak. We become chained to the yoke of culture, as he said at one time, or the yoke of city life, the yoke of luxury. Right? We get wrapped up in enjoying products that are, great, but in such a way that we become alienated from our own nature. So human civilization is simultaneously this thing that facilitates our flourishing and encourages our self-alienation. And that is, it seems to me, what he's revealing as the dynamism of human history. So I think that's a very provocative set of ideas, and I hope that's a decent introduction to this very exciting book.